OUSMANE Dieng started the season as a lottery pick, fell back down to the second round, and now is back in top 15 contention after a really strong end to his New Zealand experience. So let's find out how he got there. This is Florence Ceiling, let's break him down. France's OUSMANE Dieng is my favorite international prospect in the 2022 NBA draft. The 18-year-old wing played for the New Zealand Breakers in the Australian NBL this past season. He had an up-and-down year in many ways, but Dieng closed it out very strong and put himself back in lottery contention. At 6'11" with a 7-foot wingspan, a budding skill set, and youth on his side, Dieng projects as one of the most interesting long-term projects this summer. The first thing I want to showcase about Dieng is his playmaking. Now, he had an inconsistent year with this, but that applies to most things. Dieng just turned 19 a few days ago, and he also had to make a big step up from playing as a teenager in France to competing in a physical league for grown men. Dieng only got 1 assist per game and had more turnovers than assists on the season, but I really liked the flashes and the process. New Zealand liked to have Dieng curl into touches and screens, which worked well for the freshman. He's much better when he already has a head start because of his limited athleticism, which we will get into. Like we saw when he played for France's youth teams, Dieng is highly comfortable with the ball in his hands. He knows how to use his size to pass over the top of defenses, which fits the new day NBA very well. The 19-year-old prefers to go right and then pass to his left, which he can really do coming out of screens. And his size and length definitely allows him to get creative with passing angles and delivery. As you might expect now, Dieng can also operate out of a live dribble. We've seen him hit rollers and skip passes out of pick and rolls, but he can also do that just when he starts getting downhill. Dieng has to improve the consistency still, but I love when the French National Institute of Sport product played with his head up, looking for shooters in the corners, and trying to play fast. Of course, there are improvements to make. The most clear one is just cutting down on the turnovers. There are no worries for a 19-year-old really, but the goal with any type of playmaker is always to get more efficient while not being averse to taking risks. Dieng is not really a safe passer, so to speak, so I'm not too worried about the latter. However, he still needs to keep taking care of the ball. Dieng does not make bad reads most of the time, but his execution can still be a bit lacking. Part of this is his strength, which will be a recurring theme throughout the video, but Dieng is still too skinny to get to his spots wherever he wants. If he gets bumped off balance or has to play through traffic, the French wing can get rushed or simply struggle more than usual with his decision making. After all, he is still a lean 205 pounds. That lack of strength is partly why Dieng has difficulties finishing at the rim. Dieng made a hair under 40% of his field goals, which obviously is not ideal. And yes, he's young and adapting like I said earlier, but you still want better from someone who came into the year with top 10 buzz. Not just that, but Dieng got to the line very little, and there he only converted about 66% of his free throws. Around the basket, Dieng's main issues stem from his lack of strength and pop. He must get stronger, but even then, he is mostly a below-the-rim athlete who can only really get up if he has a runway. Dieng is not the worst athlete in the world, but he's not explosive like Scotty Barnes or anything like that, if we want to compare him to recent ball-handling big wings. Dieng is maybe more so like Cam Reddish, which is honestly not a bad outcome in my opinion, but it does pose its questions. As we're seeing in these clips, the French wing has a tough time finishing over length or through contact. It's easy to make Dieng uncomfortable around the rim. And while the NBL is physical and better built for quote-unquote traditional centers, seeing Dieng constantly be unable to finish over bigs makes me a bit uneasy. Now, the French forward does not settle for random pull-ups or anything like that, which is good, but I do worry. I don't know that there's much room for Dieng to improve athletically in terms of vertical explosiveness. He will get stronger, which should help, but I also think a big part of this will just be figuring out craftiness and angles at the rim. This should be helped by developing a consistent in-between game. Dieng is not quite there yet, but he does shoot a solid volume of floaters or push shots. One of the things I love the most about Dieng is that he is very fluid on offense for the most part, especially with the ball in his hands, so he can definitely handle into these in-between shots. Dieng likes going left and snaking into a right-handed floater. Again, he's reliant on screens or head starts to create separation getting downhill. This is not a huge problem because he is a solid ball handler, but it speaks to his lack of quick twitch athleticism. Still, Dieng has just about made enough of these shots to the point that I feel fine about him eventually overcoming some of his finishing deficiencies. As I said earlier, I'm hesitant to think that Dieng will ever develop into a top-tier athlete, so continuing to work on this floater game is going to be important to finish versus NBA caliber athletes. The story with Dieng's makes on his floaters is pretty similar. He likes to go left and then switch over. If he gets a big on a switch, then he can inflict some damage as well. This does not come super naturally to him just yet, but if he has them backpedaling, then Dieng can get his shot off even despite not going all the way to the rack. And again, he's just such a capable ball handler. I really like watching this part of his game because Dieng has a tight handle, can go side to side, use screens to manipulate, all that. He can really operate in the pick and roll. The next step for the Frenchman with his scoring is adding muscle and starting to show more than just flashes of finishing strong at the basket. As I've been saying, Dieng is still reliant on screens to get to the rim, but he's had glimpses of playing through contact, bumping, and finishing. This is exactly what I want to see. Dieng has the runway, so he attacks, moves his guy out of the way, and finishes. It is tantalizing to think about what this means if the 19-year-old can do that 2 or 3 years down the line. I also think Dieng's footwork needs to keep getting better, alongside his strength. Being able to mix in float-overs, Euro steps, and more changes of direction would also compensate for his lack of burst. After all, the handle is already there. Here, he rocks his defender to sleep, gets him with the sudden crossover, and uses that 7-foot wingspan to finish. I'd also like to see Dieng just embrace contact. If he starts getting to the free throw line more often, which he should at 6'10", that is a good start. Now let's get into the shooting. Again, Dieng has not had regularity with this, but it's the flashes that are appealing. First, let's get the elephant in the room out of the way. Dieng made just 27% of his threes with the New Zealand Breakers. Not good. But now let's watch the clips, because I think the potential is evident. The first eye-popping number relates to Dieng's improvement as the season went on. He played looser and less within himself. Over the first 10 games of his NBL career, he shot 5 of 36 for 14% from 3. In his last 10 games, that improved to 37% on 15 of 41 shooting, which would be about league average in the NBA. Dieng still has some improvement areas. For example, his release point can still get higher to maximize being 6'10" and probably still growing. He also still has to take time to really set his feet and has room to get quicker. But overall, the flashes and improvements are really there. As the season went on, Dieng started to hit step backs, punishing defenses when they went under on him, and even hunting bigs on switches to attack those mismatches with pull-up trays. Overall, I love Dieng's potential to operate out of long, rangy dribbles before rising into his shot. The flashes bode well for him, but we also cannot just ignore the possibility that he just had a hot streak. To be clear, I do think Dieng will be fine in the long term. The downside, of course, is if he becomes a 34% guy instead of like a 39% guy, but that's still passable enough to have a role in the NBA with all his other skills. Still, Dieng has never been a good shooter coming up in France. His volume was a lot higher his last 2 seasons at home, 7 and 8 threes per game, but the percentage never got higher than the low 30s. That worries me a bit, but I'm also encouraged by how many shots the French wing has historically taken. I mentioned in my Dyson Daniels video that I have some apprehensions, but not too many, because of his touch from in between and his volume of threes. Those same ideas apply to Dieng, but he will need to show constant improvements over his first few years in the US. One such improvement that is needed for Dieng will be his spot up and catch and shoot threes. We saw the flashes of Dieng pulling up off the dribble earlier. Long term, I think he should be able to do that to some extent, but that's a long ways away. To stay on the floor early on in his NBA career, he will need to hit the stationary wide-open threes that defenses give him. If he cannot make those, then Dieng will not be able to attack closeouts, get into his floater, or pass out of the live dribble. Dieng tends to rush his release and footwork on these types of trays, and as I said earlier, I also think that he still shoots the ball a bit low. So if you bother him with a strong, disciplined closeout, that can affect his shot. In today's NBA, being able to play on and off the ball is very important. Dieng struggled doing the latter in New Zealand and only excelled when his role was tweaked. Now, I'm not saying he needs to play off the ball to be good, but having that versatility will open up his game, and his team fits. If Dieng can start making more of these spot-up threes, then I immediately get more comfortable with his outlook as a draft prospect and also in terms of giving him more court time as a rookie. Dieng's draft situation is particularly interesting because he could really benefit from going to a team that will let him play through mistakes and growing pains. If he has a short leash or is drafted into an unfavorable environment, that probably is not the best step for Dieng, especially coming from the worst team in the Australian NBL. In order to fulfill his potential, Dieng also has to keep working on his handle. For the most part, it's okay. This is not really an indictment on him over this. Obviously, there will be areas for growth, but the main one is that Dieng is not adept at creating separation. Right now, he's a 1 or 2 dribble pull-up guy rather than someone who will break down his defender on his way to the rim. His handle is used to get into his shot more often than to his spots, and there could be more of a balance. But also, he's almost a nearly 7-foot ball handler who still has a narrow frame and is missing strength. He's susceptible to getting picked off, but the handle is tied to other elements of his game, so rounding it out will be key. Dieng had an equally up and down season down the other end of the floor. To start, I worry about his ability to guard in space in the NBA. Dieng has high hips, which means that it's hard for him to bend his knees and get low to the ground. That can make him upright and stiff, despite being quite fluid on the other side of the basketball. The Frenchman does not always get punished, but it can be tough for him to get back into plays or make second efforts when he's on his heels or gets blown by. This is not because of motor, but just because Dieng cannot physically recover sometimes. This happened time and time again, for example, versus the Southeast Melbourne Phoenix. But in all fairness to him, Dieng also has a lot of margin for error. A big part of it is simply the size. Dieng is a really huge wing at 6'10", which is easy to forget, but it's also why his overall package is so tantalizing. Dieng does not project to me as someone who will be switchable against most guards, but he can stay with wings and guys his size. We have to keep in mind that Dieng will usually be guarding forwards who are 6'8" and up. Most of these guys, especially if you put Dieng on spot-up shooters and such, do not have the fluidity that he does on the offensive end. This means that even though the former New Zealand man is not overly nimble on defense, it's not too problematic because he can just focus on swallowing them up with his size. Then, Dieng has just about enough foot speed to keep up with attackers if needed. Plus, he also has a solid motor, and when he's engaged, he can fight over screens or stay attached away from the play. But as is the case with most teenagers, there are definitely instances when Dieng's defensive awareness and recognition fluctuates. He's guilty sometimes of not paying attention away from the ball. That can lead up to him giving simple cuts to the rim, which then lead to easy buckets for the opposition. Another thing that happens is Dieng missing his responsibilities. For instance, in the clips we just saw, Dieng gives up an offensive rebound when he fails to put a body on his man, and then he does not pay attention to detail when he goes under the screen on a very good three-point shooter. The strength, or lack thereof, is also a factor on defense for Dieng, which should come as no surprise. This showed up fairly often in Australia because of the physicality of the league, and Dieng also took a bit to get accustomed to that. Dieng would sometimes get pushed around, be ineffective trying to protect the rim, and generally just could not always deal with grown men and established pros. But as is also usually the case with most things concerning Dieng, I buy into the flashes. I'm not going to sugarcoat things and say that he had a good defensive season in New Zealand because he did not. He was downright bad at times. But how often do you see 19-year-olds, or just rookies in general, be good on this end of the floor? Dieng had some really interesting possessions on this end of the floor. For example, here. The French wing stays engaged throughout the entire play, he tracks the ball handler, and then uses that 7-foot wingspan to get the deflection and steal, leading to the emphatic dunk. I was also quite impressed by Dieng's closeouts, which is a little niche, but he usually had pretty good technique with short, choppy steps and then understood how to use his size to bother attackers. Finally, Dieng also piques my interest as a rim protector. Not so much in terms of racking up numbers, seeing as how he only had 7 blocks for the entire season, but in terms of the roles that he could play down the line. The French forward showed enough to make me believe that he can be an effective backline defender by coming over and altering shots without necessarily getting the block. The instincts are raw, but Dieng knows when he has to rotate from the weak side, shrink the floor, or help at the rim. If he's able to combine this with his decent motor, glimpses of strong positional defense, and then show some improvements with his strength and lateral quickness, Dieng could be a very solid two-way player down the line. And even if his defense only becomes passable, that should be enough to complement his offense if that develops according to plan. Again, this has been one of the longer videos on the channel, but there's just so much to get into when it comes to OUSMANE Dieng. I'm going to keep it short, but overall, I really like him and I would pick him in the lottery, despite, his bad start to the season. However, he really grew into his role later on. I do think, there are some differences with stuff that we touched on in the video. For example, whether he becomes a 34% three-point shooter or a 39% three-point shooter does affect the rest of his game. Also, can he pull up? Can he spot up? Can he do both or just one? That will sort of affect how he gets into his playmaking, how sort of the rest of his game opens up on drives, on floaters, whether or not he's able to make that athletic leap. Maybe not from a vertical burst standpoint, but how much stronger can he get? And if so, will that facilitate, his difficulties right now on his way to the basket? Then on defense, I'll keep it brief. But right now, he's not the best defender. That's to be expected. He just turned 19 years old. He's still very skinny, 205 pounds, like I've been saying. And overall, his instincts leave a little bit to be desired at times. But his motor, for the most part, is pretty good. When he's engaged, he's shown that he can make a rotation. He's shown that he can make, a difference or at least be a factor around the rim, which is what you want a guy, who's 6'10", 6'11" to do. Overall, I really like OUSMANE Dieng. If you like OUSMANE Dieng, if you enjoyed the channel, make sure to leave a like. Make sure to leave a comment. Tell me what you think of the French wing. Who's your favorite international prospect in the draft. And as always, make sure to leave a like. Make sure to comment. Make sure to subscribe. And I'll catch you guys next time.